I think that we aren't done with problems in the banking system. Um, I think that bankers, oddly, by the way, sidebar, banking is a superb business if you do it right. It's really a blocking and tackling business. The built-in interest rate margins between deposit interest rates and lending rates is extremely attractive if you aren't stupid. Unfortunately, there's a strain of stupidity through American banking that's terrifying. The idea that you fund long-term so-called assets with very short-term deposits leaves you vulnerable to a funding crush. We saw that wreck the U.S. savings and loan industry. This isn't the first time that occurred. We saw it in 2008. The idea that the bankers needed to revisit that idiotic strategy yet another time is totally crazy. And I think it brings us to the last part of your statement with regards to managing inflation. And I really think this needs to be said.
In this insightful analysis by Rick Rule, he delves into the vulnerabilities lurking within the U.S. banking system, emphasizing the precariousness of funding long-term assets with short-term deposits. He draws parallels to historical crises, notably the havoc wreaked upon the U.S. savings and loan industry in 2008. Rule challenges the reliability of the Consumer Price Index, CPI, as a measure of inflation, highlighting its omissions of crucial expenses like food and fuel, as well as its hedonistic adjustments that skew true cost evaluations. He contends that inflation is grossly underestimated, with purchasing power erosion far exceeding CPI estimates, possibly by over 7% compounded annually. Moreover, he underscores the looming specter of off-balance sheet liabilities, citing a staggering $128 trillion in obligations versus a mere $34 trillion in on-balance sheet liabilities. Rule posits that artificially low interest rates and inflation serve as strategies to mitigate this looming debt crisis. For a comprehensive understanding of the complexities shaping our financial landscape, subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Like and share to spread this critical analysis.
The broad population and many of the politicians and many of the bureaucrats believe that the Consumer Price Index is a reliable gauge to inflation. It has become sort of the standard. And I would argue that the CPI is a constructed index and is not a reliable measure of inflation. First, the CPI, when it's inconvenient, doesn't include food or fuel. That's problematic for me. I like to eat. I fly. I drive. The second thing is that the index itself is, quote, hedonistically adjusted. And what it means is that the people who construct the index assign arbitrarily values to the quality and the changing quality of the products that you consume. So they will hedonistically adjust the price of your computer or the price of your car or the price of the apartment that you live in because of alleged qualitative differences over the last 20 years. I won't argue that there's qualitative differences, but I would argue that what you pay is what you pay. The thing that bothers me the most about relying on the CPI, though, in terms of a cost of living, is that the CPI doesn't measure tax. The idea that a consumer price index doesn't include the largest cost category for the average family in any developed country is laughable. The average family pays more in tax than they do in shelter, energy, transportation, and food combined. And yet the CPI doesn't measure tax. When I tried, poorly by the way, to understand the nature of the price rises in the basket of goods and services that I consume, note that I'm not sure that tax is a service, but we'll let that go. It would appear that the purchasing power of my savings in US dollars, arguably the strongest major currency on the planet, the value of my purchasing power is declining at about 7% compounded. There are other estimates, Shadow Stats as an example, John Williams, that would suggest that the real deterioration of the purchasing power of the US dollar is much greater. I don't know the number. I mean, in truth, I'm a credit analyst. I'm not an economist. But I'll tell you this. When you are measuring the deterioration of the purchasing power of your savings using the CPI at 2.7, you're lying to yourself. I'm not sure whether my number is 7 but I would argue for almost everybody in the United States, at least, that their purchasing power is declining by at least 5.5% a year, and probably at a greater rate. And I would challenge any of your listeners to try and imagine a circumstance where it was true. What is true is that the big thinkers, somehow, and I'm not a conspiratorialist, have caused us to believe that the CPI is a reliable number in terms of quantifying inflation, and it's not. And I probably am disingenuous complaining about inflation. The nature of systemic inflation at 7% and artificially low interest rates at 4% mean that people like myself with expertise and access to credit can borrow money cheaply, not as cheaply as 3 years ago, but cheaply still, and participate in the fact that the replacement cost of the assets that we buy is increasing at 7 to 10% compounded. So although I inveigh, if that's the right phrase, against inflation, I've come to realize that for the last 50 years of my life, I've been an amazing beneficiary of it. There is a whole class of people that, while they argue against inflation, probably owe most of their net worth to it. I tend to tell people that I'm smart and that I work hard and all that kind of stuff. But the idea that my cost of capital is artificially low and my ability to deploy capital is enhanced by virtue of the fact that the replacement cost of those assets is increasing at a much greater rate than my cost of capital is probably responsible for most of my net worth. But also, much more importantly, because the off-balance sheet liabilities of the federal government are much greater than the on-balance sheet liabilities. Sure, it's estimated that not estimated, it's noted that the on-balance sheet liabilities represented by our obligations in U.S. Treasuries is, as you suggest, $34 trillion a year. The Congressional Budget Office, not some cranky old libertarian, believes that the net present value, the discounted net present value of entitlements, people look at my face, I'm a 71-year-old, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, military pensions, that number, according to the government itself, exceeds $120 trillion. So that $120 trillion needs to be serviced by set-asides, which aren't being set aside because the deficit is $2 trillion a year. The only way not to hit a funding cliff is to inflate away the net present value of those obligations. We did it in the United States in the 1970s. That's what the 1970s was all about. By the end of the decade of the 70s, we had depreciated the value of the dollar and hence the fixed funding liabilities in dollar terms of our off-balance sheet obligations by 80%, which is to say people that had the same amount of money in 1980 as they had in 1970 were 80% poorer on a purchasing power basis. And so I think what we're seeing is artificially low interest rates, which help the government service the on-balance sheet liabilities, the interest charge on treasuries, at the same time that we see the destruction of purchasing power to inflate away the net present value of the obligations that we have in entitlements. I think your observation is exactly correct. And I think it's important that individual investors understand that.
In today's analysis, Rick Rule sheds light on critical vulnerabilities within the U.S. banking system, cautioning against the perilous practice of funding long-term assets with short-term deposits. He challenges the reliability of the Consumer Price Index, CPI, as a measure of inflation, emphasizing its exclusion of essential expenses like food and fuel. Rule highlights the discrepancy between CPI estimates and the real erosion of purchasing power, which he suggests could be as high as 7% annually. Moreover, he underscores the staggering magnitude of off-balance sheet liabilities, advocating for a deeper understanding of the mechanisms driving our financial landscape. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement is invaluable. Until next time.